So this episode is about Philip and the growth around owning and loving a dog. And there's a couple of different angles to this. One is I've been aware that a dog would be very nourishing for me for a number of years, but because I travel so much and I didn't want to put a dog in a kennel, I haven't had one. And so I bought Philip to keep my wife Jen company when she was waiting for the visa to the US in Thailand. And then when she got the visa, both she and Philip, which is the dog's name, came to the US. And so I've shared Philip with Jen in Thailand for, I don't know, roughly 6 months or so, the time I spent, during her visa application. And then he's lived with both of us here in the US ever since. So there's a couple of different growth angles around Philip. One is the phenomena that it's easier to love another in some ways than to love oneself. And I've found that a lot with Jen, where, for example, I bought her an easel to do her art and, bought her various painting supplies and things. And then, I noticed how much fun it was watching her paint, so I took up painting. And then painting brought me a lot of joy, but it began with the impulse to give a gift. And similarly, I would never have bought Philip except to, make my wife happy. And in doing so, I've found myself incredibly happy, that Philip is in many ways one of the most intelligent investments that I've made. So, number one, making my wife happy. Number two, total cost to date of, let's say, $1,200, something like that. Number three, Philip has brought probably a 30% increase in well-being to my wife and I's life. Well, if you consider a $100,000 lifestyle and look at $1,200 invested, from a financial point of view, I don't think there is a better way that I've spent $1,200, given that Philip is increasing the value, the enjoyment of a $100,000 lifestyle by 30%, meaning if Philip cost $30,000 and he increased this lifestyle by 30%, he would be still an intelligent investment. But he didn't cost $30,000, but he did increase the quality of life 30%. And so in that sense, Philip is incredibly intelligent from that angle. And then there's the angle of PTSD and trauma. It's very difficult to find human beings, particularly in the United States, that have the sensitivity, the reliability, the kind of acceptance and lack of judgmentalness, etc., as a dog. And when in the midst of PTSD, there's shame around the fact, that angry outbursts, which are one of the symptoms of PTSD, it's very easy to shame myself for impatience or for anger or for feelings of smallness or I might wake up and feel regressed and like 2 years old and not want to get out of bed. And Philip lays at my chest in the morning and just enjoys being with me. Now, the other kind of aspect I think that adds a lot to this enrichment is that I've chosen not to have children, partly because of travel, partly because of the uncertainty of relationship. The longest relationship I've had has been 4 years, and although it was a terrific relationship, when it ended, it was right that it ended. And and it really bothers me the way that our culture, sets the inadequacies of our culture onto children. And I didn't want to do that in the way that my parents did. And, and have my children carrying, the various inadequacies and stuff that I would bring as a parent. And so I don't have quite the same kind of sense of concern about that with an animal. And one of the things that Philip teaches me around trauma and PTSD is as a small dog in a giant world, like he's living around cars and houses and stuff. So, for Philip, he's surrounded by giants. And he does enter fight, flight, and freeze, the various traumatic states, just like a human being does. But one of the most beautiful things about Philip is he'll do his yoga poses, his legs stretching, his, he does his yoga poses. And then if he's been in a freeze dynamic or a run dynamic or, an overexertion dynamic, when the game is over or when the threat is over or when the fear is over, he pauses and shakes himself to release all the chemicals in his body, and he goes back to square one. He resets in a similar way to what Peter Levine talks about being a natural physiological way of resetting out of trauma. And I admire Philip so much for that, because he can go through a bigger trauma than I go through, and in 10 seconds after it's over, he shakes, resets, and he's back to being a delighted, enthusiastic, and happy dog. And he's my teacher in that sense. And so, my definition of intelligence is the efficiency with which energy is transformed into human well-being. And that energy can take the form of money, it can take the form of time, it can take the form of emotional, intensity, it can take the form of attention, it can take the form of natural resources. But if you can use attention, intention, time, money, natural resources to create extraordinary levels of well-being, it's a symptom of intelligence. And so I feel highly intelligent having chosen to invest in Philip, noticing the amount of well-being he brings to our family. Secondly, there's that remembrance that one of the best reasons to be in a great relationship is that, there are a number of things that I've done for my wife to be a better partner, to enjoy loving her, that I didn't do for myself. But having done them for her, they've come back to bless me in various ways, whether it's a house filled with art or, a beautiful dog or a better garden. There's just so many things that I thought, let's do this for Jen. And then having done that, that it's come back and blessed my life. And, and then there's healing PTSD has been the most difficult process of my entire life. Just about everything was a piece of cake compared to the intense waves of, traumatic pain, grief, loneliness, and terror, and, the inability to sleep and all of that. And so having being in the peak of that, and having Philip, and just being able to hold, being able to play. And so that's the other area of intelligence, is that if one has children, then there's the opportunity to explore innocence. There's also a certain passing off. Every parent gives a certain amount of shame, a certain amount of their disease, basically, to their child, and in doing so externalizes it in a way that helps bring a certain amount of sanity, by divvying it up, etc., amongst the family system. And, as the recipient of a lot of that insanity from my parents, I really didn't want to bring that on to a child. But I think that having children and the dispersal of energy is one of the reasons, or one of the ways, that the adults stay somewhat sane themselves. And not having those discharge points in my life has created a certain stress. Now, playing with Philip, which I do a lot, does a number of things. It cuts through chronic fatigue, for example. It cuts through depression, in the same way that I've talked in the crystal section about, looking at the rainbow and feeling the energy to get out of bed and grow and do things. I might wake up and not particularly want to get out of bed. And I feel Philip by my chest, and it's like, oh, this is a reason to live. And so there's the healing of that. Similarly, if I move my hand around, Philip will suddenly think it's a game and start jumping around. He likes nibbling. And it's quite remarkable to me that all Philip has to play, not having opposable thumbs and stuff, are his teeth. And yet he has never drawn blood in all of his frenzy and everything for me or my wife, despite, learning as a puppy and all that, and biting, things, etc. And he will stop when asked. But his immediate playfulness is absolutely delightful, as is noticing how much he wants to be close. I think that human beings are basically a pack mammalian species, and that we feel trauma in the isolation, which gives our biology the cue that we're alone, which triggers these deep biological memories that if we're a monkey without a pack, it's much easier to pick us off. There's much less warning. There's much less cooperation. You don't have someone to groom you and pull out the lights and all that. Your odds of survival go way down when you're isolated. And what we've done, particularly I think in the United States, is we have nobilized isolation under the guise of freedom. We've basically exonerated and deified freedom, as in the sense that it is both a status symbol and a sense that that's progress. To be able to do whatever you want, whenever you want to, in your own way. And there's really only one way to do that, and that is to have a giant house filled with all kinds of things and media objects and this and that and the other, all to yourself, where, watching this movie or that movie at 3 a.m. isn't going to disturb someone. And, you've got a laundry machine sitting there right when you want to do your laundry. And refrigerator sitting there with your food and nobody else eats it because there's no one else there. This sense, this idealized independence. But, another way of looking at that is going against our biology into deeper and deeper states of isolation and loneliness and dissociation, all pursuing the deity of this freedom to consume and to do without regard for other people. I do what I want when I want to do it. And so I think one of the reasons that there's more anxiety biologically in our culture is this underlying sense of, so many of us, like for years I lived in this giant house alone, so I could wander around, do what I wanted to, and yet there's this deep sense of biological loneliness, the sense that there's no sense of proximity and family and familiarity. And so, what happens when Jen and I leave Philip for even a little bit is he has a fit about it. Don't leave me. I want to be with you. And as long as he's with us, and even better in our arms, he feels incredibly relaxed. And his nervous system becomes more excited and more alarmed if his pack, isn't there. If he, as a small dog, has to face the world alone. And it's that proximity. And so Philip reminds me of biological intelligence, and also makes it safe and politically correct to need. Because human beings actually do have as much need as Philip does for connection and intimacy in a whole variety of ways and a sense of support. But it is socially taboo for human beings to express neediness. Neediness is actually a dirty word when it is a fundamental part of our biology. And so Philip showing me viscerally and with integrity, meaning when Philip needs me, if I'm leaving the car, for example, he'll paw frantically on the car windows, and we tend to see this as a sign of weakness, but I look at it as a sign of strength, because the quiet desperation that leads to addiction, loneliness, suicide, obesity, and and various diseases, emotionally, mentally, and physically in our culture, are born in this quiet desperation where people are in that need, but will do anything to hide it from a cult that shames them for their biological nature. And Philip doesn't hide it. And the result of that is that I stay much closer to Philip, which means he's much safer and much happier, because he expresses need directly and clearly, and I respond to it. I think, well, maybe I'll go out for a walk by myself. And Philip is so excited. Come on, take me, I want to go too. And some of that is curiosity and aliveness. Again, Philip is being my teacher. And some of that is the need to stay together. I want to go with you. And so I really wish that more people were like Philip, because I believe that if that impulse, when it came up in human beings, was expressed directly and clearly and without shame and judgment in our culture, I think that we would be psychologically and thus physically healthier, that our levels of paranoia, fear, loneliness, isolation, and with it distrust and feelings of unlovability, because part of the feeling of lovability comes from a feeling of being loved. And part of the feeling of being loved is the invitation and participation in close, warm, and affectionate proximity. Philip is also polyamorous, meaning he's just as happy to be with my wife as with me. He's quite playful and affectionate, and he's curious with all kinds of different dogs, etc. But he also is a bit jealous. Sometimes when my wife and I are hugging, Philip has a fit, like, where am I in this dynamic? And I don't know if it's the idea of him being left out of a group hug, or the idea that, here are his lovers, courting with someone else as opposed to him, giving attention to someone else. And there again, healthy aggression and saying, no, focus on me. I want the attention. And so overall, I would have to say that in many ways, Philip is more intelligent than I am, happier than I am, and enjoys his life with a minimum of wasted energy and angst and stuff like that. And so here we have the pinnacle of intelligence in our household, Philip, and I love him to death. And when I feel those warm bonds of love and affection, I'm so grateful to Philip for being there to love. And so the playfulness of, that I might have with a 5 or an 8-year-old child, I have with Philip all the time, rolling around on the floor, etc. All of this is good for my muscles. And so this is kind of a mental narrative that speaks to the amount of growth that has come from multiple different angles, the amount of growth, the amount of healing from having a dog. And then, as a final expression of intelligence and growing, when we go out with Philip, people get endless amounts of joy from Philip. So if I go shopping and I deliberately picked a small dog, so that like this might be a typical outing for Philip, and doing some things and holding Philip. If I meet people, they're delighted. Children smile and engage with Philip. People come up, and so in that sense, Philip perhaps brings more joy to other people just by being himself than I do, just by being myself. And so, 3 cheers for Philip, the most intelligent member of our household. Indeed.